By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was falling apart. Union armies were closing in from every direction. Railroads were gone. Richmond was starving. Desertion was rising. Even Confederate leaders knew the end was near. But governments do not disappear in a single moment. They unravel in stages. People run. Decisions stall. Panic spreads. Loyalties change. The last days of the Confederate government were messy, frantic, and often chaotic. What happened in those final weeks says a lot about how the Confederacy understood itself and how its leaders faced collapse. This video walks through those final days and what became of the people who tried to keep the government alive as everything around them crumbled. The fall of Richmond. Everything began to collapse in early April 1865. Richmond, the Confederate capital, had been under pressure for months. When Petersburg fell on the 2nd of April, the supply line to Richmond was broken. Jefferson Davis was attending church when he received a message from General Lee telling him the city could no longer be defended. He left immediately and began organizing an evacuation. People in Richmond knew what this meant. Government workers burned papers. Soldiers set fire to warehouses. Citizens grabbed whatever they could carry. Fires spread quickly and consumed blocks of the city. That night, Davis and his cabinet boarded a train heading south. They expected to regroup in another city, raise new troops, or somehow continue the war. They were leaving the capital behind. But many still believed the Confederacy could survive. Danville, the last capital. The Confederate government reached Danville, Virginia, a small industrial town near the North Carolina border. Davis issued what became known as the Last Proclamation. In it, he insisted the Confederacy would continue fighting. He encouraged citizens not to lose faith. He claimed the cause was still alive, but reality looked very different. Lee surrendered his army at Appomattox Courthouse on the 9th of April. His surrender ended the Confederacy's main fighting force. Davis heard the news while still in Danville. Cabinet members were stunned. This was the moment when many of them realized the government had no future. The Confederate government stayed in Danville for only a week before Union forces approached. Once again, they packed up and fled, fleeing through the Carolinas. After leaving Danville, the government moved into North Carolina. They reached Greensboro, then Charlotte. Every town they entered felt temporary. They moved too fast to settle anywhere. They had no supplies, no secure communication lines, and no army to protect them. Cabinet meetings grew tense. Treasury officials argued about what to do with the remaining Confederate gold. Congress members had scattered months earlier. The government was no longer functioning in any normal sense. Decisions were made on the fly, often without clear plans. At this point, many Confederate politicians abandoned Davis. Some believed surrender was the only responsible option. Others simply wanted to go home. The government was shrinking by the day. Jefferson Davis refuses to give up. Jefferson Davis still believed the Confederacy could continue the war in some form. His idea was to gather surviving troops in the Deep South, possibly in Alabama or Mississippi. He imagined regrouping and fighting a guerrilla campaign. In his mind, the Confederacy had been defeated in conventional battle, but not in spirit. His cabinet did not agree. Most of them saw Davis's plan as unrealistic and dangerous. Some worried it would lead to unnecessary bloodshed. They told him that without an army, treasury, or communications network, the government had no ability to continue. Davis did not accept this at first. He pushed on, determined to keep the government alive even as it fell apart around him. The meeting in Charlotte. The last full cabinet meeting of the Confederate government took place in Charlotte, North Carolina, on the 26th of April, 1865. By that time, word had spread that General Joseph E. Johnston had surrendered his army to General Sherman. This was the second largest Confederate army still in the field. Its surrender made Davis's plans even less realistic. During the meeting, cabinet members urged Davis to accept that the war was over. Most told him they could not support his plan for continued resistance. They argued that prolonging the conflict would lead to needless suffering. Davis listened, but did not agree. Even then, he believed the Confederacy could survive in some form. But he could not maintain a government without a cabinet. They began to resign one by one. The final flight south, after Charlotte, Davis continued traveling with a shrinking group of loyalists. He moved through South Carolina and Georgia. His goal was unclear. He talked about reaching Texas, where some Confederate troops had not yet surrendered. He also talked about escaping to Cuba or crossing into the West to rally new support. Confederate gold traveled with him in wagons. Rumors later claimed that millions of dollars in gold vanished on this journey. Most of these stories are exaggerated. Some money was lost, some was stolen, some was used to pay guards and couriers. But the idea of a hidden Confederate treasure became part of post-war legend. As Davis moved south, the group around him grew smaller. Soldiers deserted. Officials slipped away. Supplies ran out. The caravan began to look less like a government, in flight, and more like a lost band of travelers. The capture of Jefferson Davis, Davis's final days on the run, ended near Irwinville, Georgia. On May 10, 1865, Union cavalry caught up with him. The stories that spread afterward, including the rumor that he tried to escape wearing women's clothing, were untrue or exaggerated. He was tired, sick, and carrying personal belongings. Union soldiers misinterpreted part of his clothing, and newspapers turned it into a joke to humiliate him. He was taken to Fort Monroe in Virginia, where he spent 2 years in prison. With his capture, the last physical symbol of the Confederate government was gone. What happened to the cabinet members? The collapse of the Confederate government scattered its leaders across the South. Judah P. Benjamin, the Secretary of State, was one of the few who escaped. He fled to Florida, then sailed to the Bahamas, and finally reached Britain. He reinvented himself as a successful lawyer in London and never returned to the United States. Stephen Mallory, the Secretary of the Navy, was arrested but later released. He lived quietly in Florida and worked as an attorney. John C. Breckinridge, the Secretary of War and former Vice President of the United States, fled through Florida, sailed to Cuba, then went to England and Canada. He returned years later after receiving amnesty. Treasury and postal officials. Most were arrested, interrogated, and eventually released. A few kept detailed diaries about the chaotic final weeks, which helped historians piece together the story. The people who once ran a breakaway nation spent their later years scattered, disgraced, or trying to reinvent themselves. The end of the Confederate Congress. By early 1865, the Confederate Congress barely functioned. Many members had already left Richmond before it fell. Those who remained had no real role in the government's final days. They went home quietly, often facing hardship, suspicion, or poverty. Some entered politics again years later during Reconstruction. Others wrote memoirs defending their decisions. Most faded into local life. The myth-making begins. Once the war was over, people began shaping the memory of those final days. Supporters of the Confederacy tried to portray the government as noble and determined. Davis was described as unwavering and heroic. The collapse was framed as the result of overwhelming military power rather than internal weakness. Northern newspapers mocked the Confederate leadership and portrayed them as foolish and disorganized. The truth sits somewhere between these extremes. The final days of the Confederate government were a mix of stubbornness, confusion, fear, and desperation. People made decisions on the run. Loyalties shifted by the hour. The collapse was both dramatic and chaotic. A government that outlived its reality. The Confederacy as an idea lasted much longer than the Confederacy as a government. Even after its leaders fled, surrendered, or vanished, many Southerners held on to the idea of the Confederacy as a symbol. This shaped the lost cause narrative that emerged in the late 1800s. It turned a frantic collapse into a romantic story. In reality, the Confederate government ended not with a final speech or a dignified ceremony, but with scattered wagons, lost paperwork, abandoned offices, and a president on the run. The last days of the Confederate government were chaotic and filled with denial, fear, and confusion. Leaders fled from city to city, hoping to keep the government alive long after its military forces had collapsed. Cabinet members resigned. Soldiers vanished. The president refused to accept the truth until the very end. The Confederacy ended not in a single dramatic moment, but through a slow unraveling of structure and authority. What remained after that was memory myth and the long struggle to rebuild a nation divided by war. Thank you for watching. If you want more videos like this, let us know in the comments. We will see you in the next one.